In the 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower amended the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag to include the words "under God." So if no one has any objections, we're going to include those two words tonight. I'd ask you to stand and face the flag. If you can place your right hand over your heart, and even though I don't think anyone's in uniform tonight, if you prefer to salute, that's very acceptable as well. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Just going to adjust this. Can you hear me well? Okay. Welcome. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Donna Colorio, and I am a former school committee member in Worcester. In addition to serving on the Worcester School Committee, I've been an adjunct professor at Quinsigamond Community College and a Massachusetts Teachers Union member for the past 22 years. I am a mother of 3, and my youngest is still at home, and she attends a Worcester Public School, and I am furious. I have been working with Common Core for the last year and a half. In March of 2013, I was at home trying to understand what Common Core was. Now, some of you, Common Core may have just been something you just heard about recently. How many here just heard about Common Core in the last, say, month or so? Okay, thank you. The more I read, the more I became concerned, worried, and outraged. In fact, we were at a meeting just with Sandra and Jamie about a month ago in Northborough, and a parent had come for the first time to understand what Common Core was. I saw her 10 days later, and I said to her, "So what did you think?" She said, "After hearing Jamie and Sandra, I haven't slept since." At that time, I called a colleague of mine and asked if she knew of anyone in the state of Massachusetts that could come and educate maybe a dozen of us, of concerned parents, about Common Core. The name that was given to me was Sandra Stotsky. When I called Sandra, she said she felt that in order to come, she'd like to see about 100 plus in attendance. I said, wow. So I agreed, and I began to plan a forum at the Worcester Public Library, inviting everyone and anyone I knew. Surprisingly enough, this was last year in May, we had 125 in attendance. And after listening to Dr. Stotsky, I was convinced that Common Core needed to go. Common Core standards are a one-size-fits-all educational standards for K through 12th grade in English language arts and math. These standards are unproven, underfunded, and untested. I'm here to tell you that Common Core standards are going to turn the classroom into a testing environment instead of a learning environment. Common Core standards are not an education reform, but a radical transformation from classroom instruction. Simply put, the Common Core is designed to replace local and parental control over education with centralized top-down control. The purpose is to train students for jobs, not to educate them to be full, thoughtful citizens in our democratic republic. Common Core standards are not state-led. They were created and funded by special interest groups. States were strong-armed into accepting the Common Core in lieu of grant monies and waivers at the time where states were cash-strapped. Parents, elected representatives, school committee members, and teachers appear to have been largely bypassed. Tonight, you will hear from 2 experts explaining why Common Core standards are wrong for Massachusetts. We did invite the Department of Ed also to share their side of why they implemented the Common Core standards without any representation from the state. And as you can see, they're not here. We needed people, we invited the Board of Ed because they were responsible for implementing and accepting these standards along with the governor. Each guest will speak for approximately 20 minutes. Does that sound about right? And then I will take questions from the audience. So limit your questions to about 30 seconds. I then will close by talking about a new statewide group that's forming to oppose the Common Core standards and what you can do as a parent, educator, grandparent, or taxpayer to help. I hope to be finished by, I'd say, 8:45. So let's remember that Common Core is not a right or a left issue. It is a right and a wrong issue, and Common Core is wrong. Our first speaker is Jamie Gass. Jamie is Pioneer Institute's director of the Center of School Reform. At Pioneer, he was framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K through 12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as a senior policy analyst, technical writer in the state budget office under 2 Massachusetts governors. In the 1990s, Jamie worked for the Dean of Brown Boston University School of Education, Boston University Management Team, in its historic partnership with the Chelsea Public Schools. He has appeared on various local and national media outlets. He has been quoted in The Economist, Education Week, and the Boston Globe, and he has op-eds are regularly published in the Boston Herald, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, and other regional newspapers, as well as national op-eds and magazine articles in the Wall Street Journal, Education Next, and City Journal. Jamie speaks on academic standards, school choice options, the school accountability at events throughout the country. He has earned a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from Boston University. It is with great pleasure I introduce Jamie Gass.
Thanks so much, Donna, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I think it's, 10 degrees above zero, so spring is probably arriving sometime soon. But I want to thank Medway Matters, too, for setting up this event. Increasingly, we are seeing more and more events like this in Massachusetts. Sandy Stotsky and I have been doing a lot of work in about 20-some-odd states over the last couple of years on the Common Core issue. But it's really great to see how much interest is being generated right here in Massachusetts, because the fact is that from the beginning, Massachusetts really had the most to lose in this whole discussion around Common Core, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So to give you a little bit of historical context, I think the Founding Fathers were very wise. They understood that the federal government, the national government, is properly directed towards foreign policy and trade and commerce and defense, but that most of the issues that most directly touch the lives of citizens and children and teachers are really the jurisdiction of the state and local governments. The U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on K-12 education, and that was not an accident. The Founding Fathers understood that in order to perpetuate the ideals of our republic, that local government and local civic participation needed to be the wellspring for our democracy. No institution in the history of this country has been a greater representation of that than our public schools. And so while the federal government has really a minimal role in K-12 education, even at this late date, when after 30 some odd years or so of having a U.S. Department of Education, really a small amount, about 10% of the funding for K-12 education comes from the federal government. 90% of it comes from the state and local governments. And the state constitutions, including the Massachusetts Constitution, which is the oldest written constitution in the world, it was written by John Adams in 1780, is very, very specific about it. There are paragraph after paragraph of what they call the Cherish Clause, where John Adams and the framers of the Massachusetts Constitution make it clear that it's the duty of citizens and legislators in the future to cherish the interests of literature and mathematics and science, that these groundings in the liberal arts, really, what we call the liberal arts, are the wellspring for citizenship. That is to say, the founders really understood that the point of public education is for developing citizens. It's certainly important to develop well-educated workers, but first and foremost, in our democracy and under our way of life, it's education for citizenship. And in order to be a citizen, you have to understand the rights and the duties that are implicit in being a citizen. And I would argue that this arrangement of having the federal government do the things that it does well and the state and local governments do the things that they do well is really what has taken this country from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard in the last several hundred years, made us the most powerful country in the world. It's a remarkable, remarkable ascent. But it really has been this commitment to local and state government that has been the wellspring of that. In the 1830s, there's a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville. He came to this country to find out what this democracy was all about. And he was fascinated because it was totally different from anything that he saw in France or all throughout Europe, where all of the decisions were made on high by kings and queens and czars and ministers, that citizens were really kind of recipients of ideas from people on the top. And he said, what's going on in this country, in the United States, in this democracy, and he ultimately wrote a big 2-volume book called Democracy in America, is totally different because the ideas and the commitment to self-government comes from the people themselves. And it's a revolutionary idea that even still to this day is something that some people in Washington, D.C. have a difficult time with, frankly. They think the decision should be made from Washington, D.C. But in spite of this enormous ascent that this country's experienced, it was beginning to get clear a decade or two after World War II that the country was beginning to lose its edge in K-12 education. The first example of it was in the beginning of the space race, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, that we were falling behind. And then really by 1983, there was a report called A Nation at Risk. It was commissioned by the Reagan administration about how we had really gone from among the top performing countries in the world in K-12 education, and we had fallen pretty dramatically to about 15th or 20th. But what that Nation at Risk report did not do was prescribe lots of top-down solutions from Washington, D.C., because Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives had always understood that the commitment to reforming K-12 education was going to need to happen at the state and local level. And there's been a variety of different solutions to kind of fix these problems that have really been plaguing K-12 education for decades. There's some people that say we need to have a set of national standards and testing and curriculum that are driven from Washington, D.C., and that's what they do in Europe, and that's what they do in some of the high-performing countries in the world. And then there's other people that said, no, the way to improve K-12 education is to give parents more choice and develop charter schools and vouchers and allow kids to have access to private and parochial schools of their choosing, that the competition and the parental involvement will help stimulate improvements. Well, what Massachusetts did in 1993 was really different from both of those models, but in a way it integrated some of the ideals of both. Bill Weld, who was the Republican governor in the 90s, got together with Tom Birmingham, who later became the Senate president of Massachusetts. He's a pretty liberal Democrat with a great relationship with organized labor. And the third member of this sort of trio that shaped this education reform law was a guy named Mark Roosevelt, who was the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. But he too was a pretty liberal Democrat with great relationship with organized labor. And what they did is they crafted a grand bargain that made for not only good politics, but good for good policy as well. And what it was that Massachusetts and the states and the localities were going to infuse an enormous amount of money. And we've spent about $100 billion in the last 20 years on education reform at the state and local level in exchange for all of the difficult things that people in K-12 education had not wanted to do over the previous several decades, and that, from my point of view, had led to our decline. Specifically, We weren't going to do soft skills. We weren't going to do workforce development. We weren't going to do fuzzy math. We weren't going to do self-esteem. We were going to do high-quality academic standards based in the basics of English and math and science and history. And you're very fortunate because the woman who is the architect of those standards is sitting at the end of the table there. Her name is Sandra Stotsky, a genuine hero in my view for the work that she has done on K-12 standards, because the fact is that nobody in the country can claim to have standards that have correlated to the kind of gains we've seen here in Massachusetts. Specifically, what was in those standards that everybody across the political spectrum regarded as the best in the country was a deep commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama. And these things matter, and the reason why they matter is that the quality of the words and the vocabulary that you find in Greek myths and legends and classic fairy tales and books like Huckleberry Finn and Sherlock Holmes and the works of Charles Dickens, these are great stories that bind us together as human beings. They teach our children about friendship and about tragedy and comedy. They teach us how to be human. And that's really a big function of what it means not only to be a well-educated person, but to be a citizen, is to be human. And we know and see all examples around us all the time of how our civilization is not doing a very good job of just inculcating the basic understanding about human nature and how to treat one another. But that's what these standards in English really did and do. On the math side, they used the best examples from other high-performing states and the highest-performing countries in the world, folks like Japan and South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, all the kinds of countries that in 1983 the Nation at Risk report said you have to compete with those countries to be able to compete in the 21st century. Dr. Stotsky and the group of high-quality mathematicians and experts that she assembled on the math side said you've got to have Algebra 1 by 8th grade. That's what all the high-performing countries in the world do. Algebra 1 by 8th grade, because that's the gateway for all higher-level math. And it allows enough room then throughout high school to get kids into the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields that will allow them to go into those fields when they're in college. But you got to start earlier than the way most of the states and most of what's happened in this country over the last several decades. So these high quality standards, they were coupled with the MCAS test. Most of you folks probably know what the MCAS test, high stakes test, so that a graduation requirement actually means something, that the kids can read their diploma and it has real substance, academic substance connected to it with good standards. There's teacher testing that were aligned with the standards, so the kids and the teachers were all on the same page, same level of academic expectations for everybody. They did add some charter schools and some accountability measures in there. But it was really this money in exchange for the high quality standards and the high quality testing that has been a remarkable and historic success for this state. Specifically, there's a test called the NAEP test, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's been around for 35 or 40 years. It's a test that every state in the union takes every couple years in both reading and mathematics. There's also a NAEP test in science and civics as well. But no state in the history of this test had ever been #1 in every grade tested and in every category tested. And in 2005, Massachusetts did it. And then it did it again in 2007 and 2009 and 2011 and just a couple of months ago in 2013. I tell audiences this is really the equivalent of winning 5 World Series back to back and doing it in 4 straight games each time. It's a remarkable accomplishment. That's why when people were talking about a federal grant program called Race to the Top, it was really the race to become Massachusetts. But again, as the Nation at Risk report made clear in 1983, the goal is not just to compete with the other states in the Union. The goal in the 21st century is to compete with the highest performing countries in the world. So in 2007, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country. It was one of only 2 states in the country to do that. Minnesota was the other one, on a testing international testings in math and science called TIMSS testing. So Massachusetts in 2007 and 2013 tested as its own individual country. And guess what the results were? The results were that our 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science, and that in the area of mathematics, we were within the top 5 in the world. This is a remarkable accomplishment. If winning and scoring #1 on the NAEP test is winning a World Series, the success on this TIMSS test is like winning a couple Olympic gold medals. It's a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. It exceeds the expectations and wildest dreams of the people who wrote the education reform law just 20 years ago. I think they would never, ever could have predicted that we would have done this well, and we would have done so well so quickly. But it really is these standards, what it is that's taught and outlined by the state and what's taught by teachers in schools that matter. The level of academic expectations is really the central responsibility and goal and role of what schools are all about. There's a lot of discussions around K-12 education and schooling about, where are we going to put the football field or the track, or who's going to get the catering contract for lunch. These things are important, but they're much, much lower in importance than what is actually taught. The whole point of schooling is academics. That's what it's about. So, given that Massachusetts had the most to lose in this discussion around Common Core, Pioneer Institute, where I work, it's an independent think tank. It's been around for 20 years or so. We have been one of the prime movers behind a lot of the elements of the Ed Reform Act. We're big advocates of charter schools, which are independent and highly accountable public schools. We've been big advocates of school choice, that is to say, private and parochial school choice. But we've always been a big believer in academic quality, that is really what this is all about. That's what this discussion is about. So given that Massachusetts had the most to lose, we thought as researchers that our responsibility in 2009 and 2010, when Common Core came down the pike, is that we first and foremost, we thought somebody ought to take an objective, independent analysis of what it is that Common Core was all about in English and math, and how it stacked up against high standard states like Massachusetts and Minnesota and California and Texas and Indiana. So we enlisted the best experts we could find. We got Dr. Stotsky on the reading side, and then we coupled her with Jim Milgram, who was a professor of mathematics at Stanford University, who had worked on the very high quality math standards, and a guy named Zev Werman, who was a Silicon Valley engineer who also had worked on the California math standards. And we said to him, give us your honest, objective, thorough analysis of how Common Core stacks up against high standard states. And what they did, and they did 4 thorough evaluations of the 4 drafts of Common Core against the high standard states. And what they found is that at every step of the way, in these 40, 50-page crosswalks or evaluations, that Common Core was of significantly lower quality than what Massachusetts and Indiana and California and Texas and Minnesota, the high standard states, already had. Specifically, they ignored, that is to say, Common Core ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and decided to cut classic literature, poetry, and drama by about 60% for Massachusetts. So the secret sauce that had been the key element to our kids doing so well in English and reading, they cut that. They started dumping what they call informational texts. So it include things like Federal Reserve manuals, bureaucratic regulations from DC-based bureaucracies. There are some things in there that I think we would all agree. I mean, that are good, like the Gettysburg Address or a letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King. The problem is that Common Core's architects have said the way you read those historical documents is by ignoring all the history around it. So kids and teachers are supposed to forget that the Gettysburg Address took place in the middle of the Civil War. They're supposed to forget that Abraham Lincoln was consecrating a cemetery. They're probably even supposed to forget the first line which references back to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. They call this cold reading. It is both anti-historical, but it's also anti-intellectual. And the fact is as important as reading the Gettysburg Address or a letter from Birmingham jail is, those texts primarily belong in history classes. They are history speeches and historical documents. They certainly can be taught in English classes, but what English teachers are primarily trained to do is teach literature. That's why they went into it. That's what their training is, that's what their orientation is. And history teachers are primarily supposed to teach things like the Gettysburg Address. So, on the math side, Common Core, according to your experts, decided to push forward access to algebra, not in the 8th grade, but into 9th or early 10th grade. Common Core also decided to use an experimental form of geometry that had never been successful in any place it's been tried, including the former Soviet Union. And Common Core math really tops out at what Professor Milgram has characterized as Algebra 2 light. So if your child is interested in the STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, Common Core is really a road to nowhere. And this isn't me saying this. This is highly respected mathematicians, and in point of fact, even the architects, the writers of Common Core over the last several years have been quoted in newspapers, in tapes, and in testimony before the Massachusetts Department of Education saying that it does not prepare kids for STEM fields, particularly for highly competitive colleges. The goal really with Common Core is to send lots more kids to college, but in order to do that, they're going to have to dumb down the standards. And no state, in terms of academic quality, has the most to lose in this than Massachusetts. So, the next piece that we thought we'd take a look at, because people across the political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, have always known for decades that there are limits on the federal role in K-12 education. So we enlisted the former general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, two highest-ranking lawyers in the federal government. And what they did is they mapped out in lawyerly detail that there are actually 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding, directing, validating, or advancing in any way, shape, or form national standards, testing, and curriculum, which is precisely what Common Core does. It is precisely what the U.S. Department of Education has done. It is precisely what they have done by replacing our MCAS with the untested PARCC assessment. The U.S. Department of Education has illegally funded the development of the PARCC consortia that your kids are going to be taking tests under. It's not just the opinion of these lawyers. There's a couple of columns, and I've distributed copies of it. George Will has been one of the best respected syndicated columnists and political commentators in this country for the last 30 or 35 years. He's done 2 columns on this in the last 2 years, and he has cited this research, specifically saying that the U.S. Department of Education is just brushing aside federal laws that prohibit them from doing what they want to do. Okay, so the final piece of research that we have looked at related to Common Core, because even though the advocates of Common Core, and the biggest really here is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's a $40 billion foundation by former software developer and head of Microsoft, Bill Gates. They've spent about $170 million funding the development of Common Core, funding the advocacy for it, funding the various trade organizations like the Council of Chief State School Officers, the Governors Association. These are Washington, D.C. based trade organizations. They've received tens of millions of dollars to advocate and push for Common Core. What none of the people around Common Core have done, on top of improving student achievement anywhere in the last 30 years, is that they never actually bothered to do a cost projection of what it's going to cost the states and localities to implement Common Core. And of course, the federal government isn't going to pay for it because 90% of the funding around K-12 education is paid for at the state and local level. In fact, they barely even bothered to consult the state legislatures. 95% of the state legislatures across the country in states that adopted Common Core, they had no hearings, they had no bills. Most of them adopted Common Core in the summer of 2010, when everyone else was at the beach and relaxing and barbecuing and have a good time. They thought that was a really great time to have a discussion about national standards and testing that was going to impact 50 million school children. But they've been very clever. So they didn't come up with any cost projection. We thought, hey, we're researchers. This is going to cost Massachusetts, and it's going to cost the country an awful lot of money. Someone's got to take a look at it. So we got some researchers who had worked for both Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. Department of Education, had worked on Capitol Hill, had worked in testing in various states over decades. And what our independent researchers came up with a cost of was $16 billion. Specifically for Massachusetts, it's going to cost us about $350 million. So after the Commonwealth has spent $100 billion to become the highest performing state in the union, to be number one in the world in 8th grade science and internationally competitive in math and science, we're going to have to spend another $350 million to implement what are demonstrably lower quality standards. I mean, it's appalling. It's really appalling. There are other dimensions of Common Core that are troubling. We've got some research going to be coming out in the next month or two on a data collection program through the U.S. Department of Education that was funded through this federal grant program, Race to the Top, that brushes aside student privacy and parental privacy, and that really prevents the U.S. Department of Education from collecting data. They've brushed that aside. Because the point of Common Core, really, and the testing that goes with it, is not really to develop citizens. It's to start to track and direct kids towards careers. That's really what this is. It's a giant effort to begin to nationalize workforce development in this country so that state and federal bureaucrats can start picking and choosing which fields and which careers your kids are going to be going into. So we've got research coming out on that. I'm not going to talk a lot more about it, but I have to say that some of the things that the Department of Education is proposing in this area, and you can find YouTube from, there's a woman named Jane Robbins who's going to be the author of our paper. She is from Georgia. She's a Harvard Law graduate, and she and others have done some research on this data collection issue. It's creepy. I mean, I'm a father of 2 daughters. One of them is in the public schools in Massachusetts. It is creepy stuff. But stay tuned on that front. But Pioneer is a big advocate of school choice, too. And we think that having parental choice, whether it's for vocational technical schools or charter schools or private or parochial schools or virtual learning, that these options matter because they are tailored to the needs, the individual needs of families and students, and we think these matter. And one of the things we're deeply concerned about is that if all different kinds of schools, and archdiocese schools in Massachusetts have adopted Common Core too, if all these different kinds of schools are being herded into one set of standards, and in many instances one set of tests, school choice is not going to mean an awful lot. You're going to have, lots of variety of vanilla here. It is a genuinely grassroots-driven effort and a genuine grassroots pushback. We're providing a lot of the research and trying to provide the information, but the way in which these moms have gotten themselves organized over Facebook and Twitter and different groups like these has been amazing, really, to watch. So I think that the more and more this is brought to light, the more and more people learn about it, the better. And I am cautiously optimistic that we're going to begin to peel this back. But I want you to reiterate something that Donna mentioned. This is not a partisan issue. Jeb Bush, I think everyone knows, wants to run for president. He has taken a lot of Gates money, and from state after state that we've been in, particularly in red states, he has been a big advocate of it. So it's not as though if you side with Republicans that you're somehow safe. Chris Christie's also been in favor of it too. But there's also been states like New York where they've basically done a kind of short-term pause on it and are actively working on how to delay it because that's a pretty blue state, and there's been upstate parents in New York that are kind of more blue-collar, and there's been more affluent suburban parents on Long Island. They're binding together on this because they realize this is not about Republicans and Democrats or suburbs or rural areas. This is about whether parents and state and local officials are going to have control over what's taught to their children, or whether it's going to be a bunch of unelected bureaucrats from Washington, D.C. And that's really the design here. The fact is that the people that are driving this are in Washington, D.C. They really think that a one-size-fits-all approach to education is the way to go. They're hoping that people will not ask questions. They are hoping and stonewalling on Freedom of Information Act searches. And that's why events like this tonight, I think, are so encouraging. So I've given you a lot of information. I appreciate you coming out tonight. Happy to answer any questions later, but again, I appreciate your interest and I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks.
Wow, a lot of information. Every time I listen to Jamie, I just gain so much more of a knowledge base and really where this originated and what's happened. Our next speaker, Dr. Stotsky. Sandra grew up in Bridgewater and graduated from its public schools. She did her undergraduate work at the University of Michigan and completed a doctorate in reading research at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She was an active citizen in Brookline for over 40 years, serving as a board member and then president of the League of Women Voters in the 1970s. She was an elected town meeting member for 10 years and an elected library trustee for 14. She also served on many school searched and selectmen appointed committees. Her 5 children all graduated from Brookline Public Schools. She served as Senior Associate Commissioner, a professional position, at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education from 1999 to 2003, where she was in charge of developing or revising the state's K-12 standards, teachers' licensure tests, and teacher and administrative licensure regulations. She served on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education from 2006 to 2010, a citizen's position, on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel from 2006 to 2008, and on the Common Core Validation Committee for 2009 to 2010. She was one of the 5 members of the Validation Committee who would not sign off on the standards as being validated. She was also editor of NCTE's premier research journal, Research in the Teaching of English, from 1991 to 1997. She was published extensively in professional journals and written several books. Sandra now travels the country speaking about the truth about Common Core. It is with great pleasure I introduce Sandra Stotsky.
How does that work? Okay, thank you.
I think we should put this right in front. How do we?
Is that, yeah, that seems to be mic'd. Okay. Well, raise your hand if this isn't coming through. I don't like to hold a mic because I wave my hands when I talk, so used to talking with my hands. Let me just start off with a little bit about the philosophy that I brought to my work in the department over 10 years ago with the standards that you have had in your schools until the last couple of years. Your teachers and the students who've been in your schools have had the benefit of these standards since about 2000. What was the philosophy I brought as I supervised the development or revision of all of our major K-12 standards, plus a few other things? First of all, my goal, and it was supported by Commissioner David Driscoll and a Board of Education and a succession of governors at the time, was to raise academic achievement for all children. I wasn't concerned about groups, it was for all kids. The idea was that we needed to raise academic achievement in our public schools because there has really been a 50-year decline that goes back before Common Core. Wasn't caused by Common Core, but it goes back at least 50 years, and the goal was to get everybody doing better, reading more, doing better, stronger, more rigorous math than before. Secondly, my focus was also on content knowledge. I'm a deep believer in having a lot of knowledge in one's head, not just to rely on Google or going to encyclopedias or dictionaries, but to actually know a lot. That relates to the ability to do analytical and then critical thinking. You have to know a lot. So wherever I could, I was building up a focus on content knowledge. Finally, and this is a very important piece because I found myself rewriting teacher licensing regulations and teacher licensure tests, we needed to strengthen the teacher corps in this state. We need to do it nationally. If you want to have first-class academic standards taught, you need to have academically stronger teachers in this country. And this is not happening with the current so-called reform that is coming from Washington, D.C. So those were the three basic prongs that I would use to explain the quotes Massachusetts education miracle. Now I'll move to my work on the so-called validation committee, which was one of the many committees established by those groups that had sponsored the development of Common Core. I was on, as Donna mentioned, that committee from 2009 to 2010, based on what else I had been doing in the past 15 years, particularly in education here and on these various national committees in mathematics and in other areas. And I discovered, and I will point out some of the clues as I go along, that 4 major groups were basically excluded from contributing to the development of these supposed national standards. First of all, no parents were involved. Secondly, there were almost no teachers involved. I have been in my life an elementary and a high school teacher, so I look to see whether there is input from teachers. Third, state legislators weren't involved. They pay the bills at the state level. Finally, there were no members of local school boards involved, or school committees, as we call them in New England. So these 4 groups, huge groups, who make all the difference for what happens in your public schools, were absent from the major committees set up by Common Core. I'm going to go through a number of facts, and these are facts, and I will then talk a little bit about these facts. They're not opinions, they're not perspectives, they are facts. And when you have officials in this state or in other states or nationally who talk about opinions and perspectives, it means only that they can't deal with the facts. Who developed Common Core standards? We know that 3 private organizations in Washington, D.C. were responsible. You've heard their names: the National Governors Association, the Council for Chief State School Officers, and Achieve Incorporated, a spin-off of the NGA. And they were funded for this purpose by a 4th private organization, the Gates Foundation. You would wonder why this committee was given this charge when there was only one mathematician on it, Professor Milgram. No high school math teachers, a lot of education, doctorates, people who taught math ed, but they don't even teach math at the college level. So why were they on this committee? I was the only English language arts standards expert. There were a few people from the schools, administrators, and a few elementary grade teachers. But basically, there were only 2 content experts, Professor Milgram and I, which was why we talked to each other a lot, because we couldn't understand what kind of a committee this was that we were on when there were no high school math and English teachers until I complained enough about the absence of English teachers, and they finally got one put on the committee to make me happy. I am not one, as you can see, who keeps quiet about these things. I was one of those tiger mums in Brookline. They all knew me. What was the real purpose of the validation committee? We finally concluded we were to serve as rubber stamps. And that was what they asked us in May of 2010 to sign a form that said these standards were internationally benchmarked. This is very important, legally. They're not, of course. Research-based and rigorous. And Milgram and I, a few other people on this committee, refused to sign off. You would never know that from the little report that Common Core put up on its website. All they did was put the names of all those on the committee who dutifully signed off that these standards met those criteria. Professor Milgram had a 13-page critique, which he put up on his own homepage, Stanford University. I had a very lengthy letter that I also posted and sent around to the Board of Education here in Massachusetts. I must say my colleagues paid absolutely no attention because it was a done deal here in Massachusetts. What does that mean? It means that no matter what I said about the deficiencies of these standards in English, which I'll get to in a minute, we were going to be adopting Common Core's standards in 2010, which we did in July at a board vote, because $250 million had been promised and raised to the top money. And no Department of Education was going to turn up $250 million and keep standards when this board that had been appointed by Governor Patrick had been told we're dumping the ELA and math standards we have and adopting Common Core's. And that is exactly what happened in July 2010. I left the board the next month, and that was by design because my questions were unacceptable and they weren't being answered by anybody. No one ever responded to me. I kept trying to find out from the standards writers of the English language arts for Common Core why they were doing the things they were doing, and I couldn't get anyone to even respond to me. So I couldn't get answers to any of the basic questions about the problems in the document that I could see based on what I knew from the standards that I had developed here in Massachusetts that were used for over 10 years. What are some of the, first of all, before I go into those, what were some of the major deficiencies of Common Core standards? I want you to keep this in mind because you need to realize that despite the fact that you will be told over and over again they are rigorous, they're internationally benchmarked, etc., they are not. And our board, State Board of Education, adopted in July 2010 a set of standards based on a false promise that they would be internationally benchmarked. So as far as I'm concerned, that board vote is really null and void. Whether our legislators want to act on that is going to be up to them. I know there is now an attempt being made to get a bill through to pause Common Core. But there was no informed discussion of any of the important features or problems in the document. First of all, as you've heard, there are no STEM standards, no standards for pre-calculus, not a full course worth of standards for trigonometry. Common Core standards end with weak algebra 2, which means that you will not have students prepared unless your math departments in your local high schools do something on their own, which they can, but it won't be part of Common Core. It won't be tested, and the teachers won't be evaluated for that. They will only be evaluated for addressing Common Core. But it means that you cannot begin your freshman year in college with the kind of math and science course that would enable you to be a major in a science, in mathematics, in engineering, in economics, in finance, in computer science, and there are probably others. All the STEM majors, which are today 4 years, assume that a student can begin with an advanced course, if not Calculus 1, at least a course that would be comparably difficult. in math or science. Science, of course, is being hit hard in the 11th and 12th grade, because if the math isn't there, then the full-year lab-based physics course is going to have its problems. So it's not clear to many parents that having deficiencies in math means there are deficiencies in other parts of the high school curriculum, particularly in grades 11 and 12. In any event, this was something that Professor Milgram could see because he was a mathematician. What were some of the other major issues? Deferring Algebra 1 to grade 9, the completion of Algebra 1. You will hear that, oh yes, there are algebra standards in grades 7 and 8, but you cannot complete it under Common Core until grade 9. Figure it out. Algebra 1 in grade 9, Geometry grade 10, Weak Algebra 2 in grade 11. You certainly don't get to calculus unless you go to summer school or you double up. That matters to engineering schools. I don't think they understand what's going to hit them. One of the charges to the whole idea, to the groups that were developing national standards, was that we needed to increase the STEM pipeline. You hear a lot about that. What they don't understand, U.S. Chamber of Commerce is probably the chief culprit here, because they are all in favor of Common Core, and I can't believe any of them knows how to read a set of high school math standards. They don't understand that what Common Core is doing is shrinking the STEM pipeline, not increasing it. What does that mean for this country? We don't know yet. All this is a work in progress. And I can't get answers, Professor Milgram can't get answers. Why were these STEM standards left out? We're not talking about requiring those subjects for a high school diploma. They never were, but they were always available as coursework for those students who are interested and capable of doing trig and pre-calculus and even calculus. Even College Board person, Trevor Packett, a vice president there, has said calculus doesn't fit into the Common Core math sequence. So in a few years, we expect that the AP test in calculus will no longer be available. After all, how can kids get to it in high school? There's no way, unless special arrangements are made. There's an equity issue, of course, involved in all of this, as you can see. High schools with mathematically literate parents may teach the right courses. High schools where parents are not that sophisticated may not have those kinds of courses available. But this is all to be played out. What are the problems, and I'll do this quickly because I want to hear your questions. What are the problems with the ELA standards in particular? First of all, most of them are content-free skills. They're not content standards. There are only a few standards at the high school level with content, and I put them there. I was asked what I wanted to have there, and I said you need a few content standards. Otherwise, the rest are skills. Skills can be at any grade level. They contain no indication of reading difficulty or of cultural relevance. So you have a very empty set of skill-based standards, called standards when they really aren't, and that gives the test item developers a lot of free rein. What they're going to come up with, we don't know, because they're in the process right now of developing and piloting test items. So if there's a way for you to find out what's on these test items, ask teachers, ask your students, your children. Find out where the passages are coming from. I've been trying to find out for 3 years and still haven't found out. You see, we had a law in Massachusetts as part of the Ed Reform Act that said every year test items used on MCAS have to be released publicly. That was part of the original legislation. It's not going to happen with PARC or Smarter Balance, which is the other testing consortium. So I don't know how we're going to find out and vet what our kids are being tested by, especially the college readiness test in grade 11. Second issue, second flaw, which I discovered only more recently, is that Common Core stresses writing much more than reading at every grade level. Those of you, and I don't know how many of you have children in the early grades, may know this already from your children's experience. What is not good about this is the fact that the balance should be the other way. 100 years of research, and any good teacher will tell you you need to do more reading than writing. All good writers are good readers. If you want to produce good writing, you have to do a lot of good reading. That's the way the mind works. You have to absorb the structure and vocabulary of good English. You're going to learn how to write it. Yes, you do have to write and practice writing. But there's even writing in math. Math is being turned into a semi-language arts class, which is not making many kids and parents happy about it. Instead of symbol manipulation, it's involving a lot of explanatory writing starting in grade 1. This is a whole different area of problems and requires other details. We have developmentally inappropriate standards at many grade levels, and early childhood educators have complained about that. They aren't coordinated with the reading standards, which would help to at least serve to fill that gap. You have to read certain things before you're asked to write certain things. If you want to be able to write something with a claim, you have to see what a claim looks like in a piece of writing, in some reading selection. But they're not matched that way. The one thing that has hit the media over the past year has been what was apparently David Coleman's idiosyncratic notion that 50% of what English teachers teach should be informational or nonfiction reading. Why? We don't know. There's nothing that suggests it will do anything in the English class. Of course, kids have to read informational text, but that's what they're supposed to be doing in math, science, history, and elsewhere. But English teachers have always taught complex literary texts, and teaching kids how to read between the lines of a complex literary text is how you learn how to do analytical reading. You don't learn analytical reading from reading your textbooks in the other subjects. It just doesn't turn out that way. So Common Core's standards, finally, are not fewer, clearer, and deeper, which is part of the mantra that you're often given. Why are they not fewer, even though they look like you have a small number of standards? When I went through it carefully, it turned out that often you have several statements bundled into one sentence called a standard, separated by colons or semicolons. I understand that little trick. But it doesn't mean you have something fewer. It means you usually have something that's muddier, not as clear to understand. But they're called fewer because they put all these things into one statement called a standard. So there are all kinds of problems that should be answered to by someone from the State Board of Ed, someone from the department, or from the Secretary of Education, and not one of them comes to any of the meetings where I talk. Not one of them. I don't care whether a teacher shows up or someone else, but the people who voted in Common Core, who pushed for it, the policy, should be speaking to parents everywhere, justifying what they did. And they're not. So you have a problem with your so-called public servants at the state level trying to keep in the back room and let your kids be the guinea pigs for what some of us have concluded is a vast scheme of social engineering, about 2 grades worth lower at the high school level than what we already have, so that a lot more kids can go on to college, be retained, come out with a degree that doesn't mean they know any more than they now know. Anyway, I will stop now. Please bring up your comments.
I just want to touch upon one thing that Sandra just was talking to you about, and this is just my personal experience. My daughter is now in 10th grade. When she was in 8th grade, she was in a school that had non-Common Core algebra. She was in the highest possible grade. She's in that little cluster, you know, that they do all the like special things, you know, the honors, whatever. I don't know, she had a 97, 96 average, Algebra 1. Perfect. The next year, she went into 9th grade, which was what? Common Core math. Guess what they told her? You need to repeat Algebra 1. Now, I, on the other hand, was not with it back then, or was just getting saying, what do you know? And she's like, oh, Mom, I'll take it, you know, because everybody else is taking it. And I wasn't really causing too many waves. Well, the teacher didn't know what she was doing. She had no clue, no professional development. She struggled through it. She practically cried through the whole thing. Came out, of course, with a high 90-something average. So this year, she is taking geometry and Algebra 2 at the same time, because she will be taking calculus before she graduates, because she's going into the STEM program. She's in an engineering program. So there are parents out there that don't understand the pathway and won't question it. Even myself, I'm highly educated, was on the school committee. I didn't have a clue at the time. So it's something that has been really, we've had no clue of what's happening, and now parents are waking up and starting to challenge the schools and, you know, the people that are in authority. And unfortunately, we don't have anybody here that does policy for the state, which would be great if they would come to one of our events, so we could question them and we could ask them, you know, some of the questions that we're dying to ask them.
Serious issue across this country, and what I am telling people, generally speaking, that unless there is a state law that explicitly forbids you or parents from opting their kids out of a Common Core-based test, you can do what you want. I was told when I was on the state board by the same legal counsel, who was still in the department, that what the law does not explicitly forbid, you can do. And this is certainly true in most areas of life. The law doesn't forbid you to walk across the street, you can walk across the street. If the law says you cannot cross except at a crossing, then there could be a penalty for it. But the point is, the law has to specify something, otherwise you can do it. If the law doesn't forbid you from doing something, you can do it. That was why the department is backing up.
So, I mean, I think the first thing you have to remember is that Massachusetts has not officially adopted PARCC as a replacement for MCAS. As it stands right now, MCAS is still the graduation requirement test. They are piloting MCAS and will over the next year or so, and then the Board of Education has to take an official vote to replace MCAS with PARCC. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a state law that explicitly prohibits state law to be subordinated to a federal grant program. The way in which Massachusetts adopted Common Core and the way it signed on and agreed to do the PARCC testing, even in a pilot form, was through a federal grant program. I mentioned earlier that there was never any bill in Massachusetts. This is a major amendment to the Massachusetts Education Reform Act of 1993. It's a major change. MCAS is specifically cited in that law. This is a major amendment to it. The PARCC would be a major amendment to that law. There's never been any hearings about either Common Core or the PARCC. And the other thing, and I didn't mention the specific statutes, but you know, the research that we did makes clear that the U.S. Department of Education may not directly fund any national testing. They have directly funded the PARCC testing. And on top of that, it's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson. There's the General Education Provision Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, and the U.S. Department of Education enabling legislation set up in 1979 by Jimmy Carter. Two of the three presidents that signed those were Democrats. All three of those laws are very clear. The federal government may not fund direct advanced national standards and testing. That is precisely what the PARCC is. It's a national test. So, you know, look, the commissioner on top of that was asking districts to do this pilot test and in some respect brush aside the MCAS test before he had even got secured a waiver from the No Child Left Behind law from the U.S. Department of Education. He has since gotten that waiver, but when he was asking districts to do this, he did not have the waiver in hand.
Just add one more detail here. It is understandable why the department wants kids to take both tests, or at least the PARCC test, which is being piloted, because they would like that information. But there is nothing that requires a piloting test, a pilot test, to be taken by kids in the statute specifically. So they're caught because and no legislature today in any state is going to give permission for kids to be, or say kids cannot opt out of a pilot test for a Common Core-based test. So officials are now stuck. They must have these Common Core tests that they're developing be piloted so that they can see where the items fall and decide what level of difficulty and so forth. But there are parents in all states who know that they can opt out, and they're being told by the ACLU and other groups who've looked into the matter that the law doesn't forbid it, and of course there couldn't be a law that is that specific. Then there's nothing the department can say except to admonish people and say, you should be taking the test. You need to take the test. But nobody has to pay any attention to the department on this issue.
So first of all, there is a state law that says that any bill that is connected, that has costs connected with it in Massachusetts has to be initiated through the House and Senate Ways and Means Committee. So there was, and there will be huge costs connected to this. There was no bill that was filed in the House and Senate Ways and Means Committee. So and it's also clear that the department itself has never done a cost projection. We know that because we have asked them, we have done a Freedom of Information Act search around it. They have not done any cost projection. So the fact is that they probably learned from Pioneer Institute what it's going to cost. I don't think they have any idea whatsoever how this is going to impact the localities. And so the fact is that they don't know, and I think the fact is that they're just pushing the cost along. I think what their argument is, and I'm not sure it's it's a pretty slippery argument. What they're basically saying is that, well, Massachusetts is already spending money for these kinds of MCAS tests locally anyway. So when we transition over to it, that this is just a part of the cost. But the fact is, and we know this from the research that we've done, is that it will require all new textbooks. So even if they bought textbooks just before Massachusetts adopted Common Core, you have to throw all those textbooks out because they're not Common Core aligned. They have to do professional development for all the teachers with Common Core. And then the big driver is the multi-year technology costs, because MCAS is not administered online or through computers, a paper and pencil test. So the fact is that they didn't do any cost projection on it. They're just pushing it along to the localities. I mean, there are sort of more dimensions of it that we could talk about, but that's really what it boils down to. That they're expecting the localities are going to just absorb this cost. And I think we've seen this in community after community that we've spoken in, where there's just these additional costs that are just starting to pop up. Sometimes they're $1 million, sometimes they're $500,000, and it's just, it's one of these things. They just kind of pass it along. Part of what they're doing is because they have had a total unwillingness to engage the public in a public debate and discussion on this. They're just trying to do it administratively or bureaucratically, and they're trying to push it along so quickly and bake it in and wrap its little tentacles around everything so that by the time people wake up, they'll say, well, we've already been doing this for several years. We can't undo it now, which is totally I mean, it's totally erroneous. In any business, for example, there's a thing called a sunk cost. I mean, if a auto manufacturer realizes that they're producing cars that don't drive or function properly, they don't just keep making bad cars. They stop the production and they regard that as a sunk cost. And that's really what, Common Core is in this instance.
Let me answer your second one first. Yes, departments of education all over the country are on board with Common Core. And in some cases, more and more I'm finding the Gates Foundation has literally given many departments of education directly money to promote Common Core. I cannot say that here because I don't have any information, but there is a line item of $200,000 that went to Idaho's Department of Education, Colorado. I mean, money has been going directly to departments of education to promote Common Core. You're getting ads that come out all the time, and a good part of the money behind those ads is coming from the Gates Foundation. This is just the way it is. Now, as far as where the data is going, we don't know yet, because this is still a work in progress, but the state departments of education will get the scores back, although they have contractual arrangements from PARC and SBAC, which are the two testing consortia, that allow the data to go to the federal government. It doesn't go directly to the federal government, but there are, this is what some of the people are beginning to look at. It goes to one source, and then the other source has a contract to send the data on. So it's a little harder to figure out how to track all of this eventually. Why they're asking what they're asking for, we also don't know, because there are 400 points of data. Some of this is personal identification information that is very private to families. We don't know. No one's telling us exactly what this is for. And so it just gets rolled out. Once you get sort of like a camel's nose under the tent, then the rest of the camel begins to appear year after year. And this seems to be that kind of a situation. We just don't really know.
So Sandy's right. Part of the Massachusetts Race to the Top application, and it's true of all the Race to the Top applications across the country, have a commitment to a longitudinal data collection system. Again, there are federal laws, FERPA laws, there are parent and student privacy laws that are really supposed to prohibit the federal government from collecting this kind of data. But this longitudinal data collection system is a key component, not of Common Core itself, but part of what the U.S. Department of Education is doing. I mean, the goal here really is to stack the standards, the testing, the teacher evaluations, and the data on top of one another. So that again, if you're a central planner, you can't have enough data. Their view is that if you have all this data on these children, then you can start making decisions about how those kids should be tested or how they should be directed towards certain careers. What we know from the experience of 20 years in Massachusetts, and we know this from the Massachusetts charter schools, which are some of the highest performing charter schools and best performing public schools in the country, is that you need about 10 pieces of data. I mean, if kids are not doing well in a particular grade level on certain questions on MCAS, which was all released to the public, then you can improve the quality of instruction. You can work with teachers on those specific questions and make instructional improvements. You don't need 400 pieces of data to improve student achievement. This is part of something much, much larger. I wouldn't describe it as a conspiracy because it's in plain sight. This is what it is that these people have been wanting to do for 20 years. Achieve Inc., the Governor's Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the Gates folks, they really believe in a national workforce development system. They don't really believe in K-12 education as an academic model. It's a workforce development model. They've written about these empty skills and this sort of workforce development approach for 20 or 30 years. This is their philosophy. So On the DOE side, yes, Massachusetts is a full, Department of Education is a full-throated advocate of Common Core. They took the $250 million to adopt. The governor is a close ally of the president. And the fact is that Mitch Chester, the Commissioner of Education, while he had nothing to do with the performance of Massachusetts getting to be #1 in the country or internationally competitive, all of that was solidified well before he was even here in Massachusetts. The people that were driving Common Core realized they needed to have some representative from Massachusetts heading up the park assessment. So he is. But that's one of the big reasons why. And Sandy's exactly right. New York is a good example. We did a blog just recently on it. The Gates Foundation is dumping an enormous amount of money in state departments of education because they don't really view these organizations, these state departments of ed, as really representing the states anymore. They see them as little administrative units of the federal government, even though the money paying for it largely comes from the state and local level. Well, again, the whole idea is that as Sandy mentioned, is that through the park assessment, for example, it's part of the federal contract with PARC is that they're going to share that not only the testing data, but any other data that PARC or the Mass Department of Education deems necessary, and apparently these other 400 data points is what they deem necessary, they're going to share that with whoever they want. I mean, that's part of brushing aside these FERPA laws and giving themselves bureaucratically a lot more leeway. But no, I mean, there's enormous issues here with student security, and we know more and more that whether it's NSA or these other organizations, they love to have the data on kids. But I don't have any confidence that unless parents refuse to provide it, that they won't take it.
Donna, could I talk about Colorao's bill, because I think they should know about that.
Okay, what, Kiko?
Kiko, is that
Yes,
her name? I'm
yes.
sorry, pronounced it wrong.
Yes.
A legislator from this general area, Bristol County, and I'm not sure whether she's from Fall River or not,
Yes.
but she has just filed a bill in the state legislature. Oral is her last name. And she is looking for legislators to co-sponsor the bill for her, which is, I haven't read it, but I gather it is to pause.
I have a copy for you.
Okay, is to pause the implementation of Common Core until at least after the next election. That just goes along with what I said, but when I was on the validation committee, the first thing we had to do in order to stay on the committee was sign a confidentiality agreement. For the rest of our lives, we could never talk about anything that happened on that committee. What it did, what products it came up with. I mean, given my background in town meeting and being an active citizen in my home community, you can imagine how that hit me like a ton of bricks, that I had to sign a confidentiality agreement to be on this committee. We did in order to be on the committee. And that's why no one to this day, and I am very careful about that, ever talk about what this committee actually did. There's nothing that we can say because of that. But that was all part of the non-transparency of this whole operation. That's the thing to take away from it, that it was a totally non-transparent process from beginning to end. And the stealth standards, as I say, came to the department. They were released in June of 2010, and within 60 days, or about sometimes within minutes, 45 states had adopted these standards. Obviously, they didn't go through a public process of deliberation or discussion. If within minutes in some cases, and in some cases, like Kentucky, they voted to adopt the standards before they were written.
If I can just make one comment that I had mentioned. So the thing that's particularly troubling about this is that Massachusetts is in this park consortia. So if there's any changes to these testing, Massachusetts doesn't act unilaterally anymore. We have to consult the other 17 or 20 states to make any changes. The other thing, too, that you'll hear a lot from your local superintendents is that, well, your Common Core is a floor. The fact is that the whole point of Common Core is uniformity. So if there's only one thing that you remember tonight, is that Massachusetts now has the same academic expectations as they do in Alabama and Louisiana and Arkansas. Massachusetts will, on these national park tests, they'll test what is in common between these states. So even if your local superintendent, or even if they say, you can add 15% onto Common Core, that will be on the test, and if it's not on the test, it's not going to get taught. And the reason why it won't get taught is because the teacher evaluations are going to be linked to test scores. So a teacher can add something on that's extra, but it's really going to be against his or her best interest to do it because it won't be on the test.
Could I add one more thing? There is no mechanism for revising Common Core standards.
Yeah.
Not only are they copyrighted by the two organizations that developed them, but they did not put in place any mechanism for revising them. In other words, they have been set in concrete. And no one knows, because legislators ask about this in every state, how do we revise them? That is the thing that needs to be happening in every state, that not only do we pause implementation of Common Core, but we break its back by setting up a committee to revise these standards. And where we get the suggestions from your teaching core. Your unions can ask teachers in every school system to send their suggestions for revising their grade level and subject without violating any rules, and then it's up to the legislature to decide if it's going to set up a committee that bypasses the Department of Ed, because that is the critical piece. It bypasses the commissioner, the Board of Ed, and the Department of Ed. It has to be under, as I have been suggesting, because I've been looking for where could you get a group to really develop a better set of standards, academic deans from your colleges. Would make sense, since college readiness is part of what they have to be at the high school level. Get somebody who actually is at the college level in science, engineering, or math to chair a committee and get them revised. There would be a groundswell of interest in this state.
So, under the Massachusetts Education Reform Law, there's a thing called charter public schools. They are independent public schools that are approved by the State Board of Education. They're not approved locally by a local school board. The Board of Education approves them. And what they are is independent public schools that are highly accountable. So they basically have 5 years to deliver on higher quality performance for their students. The students are selected through a lottery, an independent and blind lottery. But the thing is that if those schools don't perform in that 5-year period of time, they can be shut down. And Massachusetts has a very good rate, not only of shutting down charter schools that don't perform, but researchers from Stanford and from Harvard and MIT and several different kinds of research papers have made it clear that the charter schools in Massachusetts are the gold standard. They're the best charter schools in the country, and in fact, the charter schools that are in Boston, which have largely poor and minority students in their, 80–90% of their students, outperform the wealthiest suburbs in Massachusetts. So they're really a great school. The vocational technical schools probably saw the biggest improvement in their academic performance under the standards that Dr. Stotsky developed. So while the advocates of Common Core talk about career readiness, vocational technical schools in Massachusetts, particularly the regional vocational technical schools, saw a 40% improvement in their academic performance on MCAS due to the standards. As it turns out, if you're an engineer or a electrician or a carpenter or work in an auto shop, that you need to be able to read well and write well and be able to work with numbers. The auto shops and these enterprises are changing dramatically, particularly with the advent of technology and computers. But the vocational technical schools have done a phenomenal job improving the academic achievement, which of course then translates to better trained carpenters, et cetera. So they're basically two school choice models. They're public school options. The VocTech schools in Massachusetts are the gold standard. They're not only some of the earliest VocTech models in the country, but they also have a remarkable record of achievement. And it's even more remarkable given that they serve twice the number of special needs students than the state average. So they're both, from my point of view, excellent models. And Pioneer's done a lot of papers on both charter schools and both tech schools. So.
That is a different story. For Massachusetts, the vote to adopt was in July 2010. So the implementation of the standards themselves didn't start probably until the next year, 2011. So you've had a couple of years of teachers and local schools implementing or adopting, putting in the standards that are there and developing curriculum to address the standards, buying textbooks, having professional development. This is the year the pilot testing was to take place, and next year is supposed to be the first full year in which the regular test is given that is based on Common Core. There are about 25 or more states right now that are trying through the legislative process to either pause, defund, or get rid of Common Core. They are finding it's a very sticky jar of molasses. It was very cleverly thought through to begin with because it was adopted by state boards of education in almost all states, which is what the statutes generally allow. And the state legislatures didn't even know what was happening. So in many cases, the problem is how do they muster up enough votes in the legislature to go over a state board of education's vote. No state board of education has rescinded its vote. Many of them are beholden to a governor, whether it's Republican or Democrat, that appointed them. And I am now involved right now in the Indiana case, so I do know what is going on. And even though as of last week or a couple of days ago, Governor Pence is claiming that he has gotten rid of Common Core, the problem is the drafting committee put in place by his Department of Education is giving him Common Core as the new set of standards. So Common Core is being replaced by Common Core. It sounds like a victory, and it may turn out differently. I won't go into my own role in all of this because I won't review a set of standards that are like Common Core because I've done it for 4 years, and I've been talking about this for 4 years. But Indiana is in the middle of this crisis right now, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. Other states are not finding it easy. Bills get killed in committee. This is a deliberate strategy because there are about 5 states. There is Gates money going, we know that, to many state legislators, to certain groups that arrange for the bill to be killed in committee, and it's been killed in very unusual, bizarre ways. Someone forgot to file it by the deadline, something as innocuous sounding as that. But what is happening is a refusal to discuss this policy, to discuss Common Core. The idea seems to be get facts on the ground, get a test in place, and then once you have a test and you've wiped out the past, then there's no other place to go. So the last part of what you said, is it too late? No, it's not too late before the test is given. It'll be much harder once the test is given. That's why there is now a national effort to get parents to opt out, because what they need is the data from the test scores. The unions are asking for moratoriums. This is, by the way, teachers, parents, and unions getting together in many states for the first time. Not PTAs, but parent groups that have organized. So the unions are hearing from the teachers who are giving them feedback because teachers are afraid to speak up in many places. They don't want to be evaluated negatively, and they've been told that they can't speak up against Common Core, literally, in some places. So you have different situations across the country in different states, depending upon the governor, the legislature, the personalities of the people that are involved in all of this. You have to go by what's in your own state. So I just can't generalize any more than that. Well, there are arguments to be made on the other side, and the other side will make them. And I have an example of a kind of example, not the one that an electrical engineer dad has made viral apparently on Facebook, where simply you had to subtract whatever it was, 230 from 400 and something, and the poor little child who was in second, third grade had to come up with 4 different strategies for showing how that subtraction example could take place. There is a case to be made for having students understanding what they're doing, and that's the argument that will be made. The question is how much time you put the child through in the early grades for that, and what you take time away from if they're going to be writing out their explanations, which is supposedly the case being made. Now, first and second graders have a tougher time writing out explanations than obviously 7th or 8th graders do. So you have to look at the age of the child, how much fluency you want. I saw an argument by 2 of the standards writers themselves saying that no, this is not what they intended with their math standards. But nevertheless, someone else said, yes, it is. If you read through all of the material that goes with a math standard, it does say find strategies, use the strategies. We're not just looking to find out the correct answer, we want to find out the process by which the child goes. So there is a judgment call to be made, and this is what teachers have done for hundreds of years, thousands of years. How much time do you spend teaching the basic arithmetical operations in the early grades? At what point do you expect fluency? And then when do you expect deeper understanding of some of these operations so that you understand formulas? There are different opinions on this, but it is being protracted. And Jim Milgram, who is the mathematician who wrote the math standards in California, which are considered the gold standard for math standards, he was part of a group of 4 mathematicians from Stanford who did that, says that part of the problem is that kids are asked in the early grades to come up with their own algorithm for doing something, in other words, one of these strategies, and so that by grade 7 and 8, they're 2 years behind their peers in high-achieving Asian countries, because they complete by grade 6 what we take 8 years to do. And that is his ballpark estimate because he knows the math in other countries as well. Mathematics is, as far as symbols, are the same everywhere, so he has an understanding of what children are expected to be able to complete by the end of grade 6, so that in many other countries they study geometry and algebra together in grade 7 and 8 and do advanced stuff in high school.
I think it is a federal grab of power, but I have been spending the last 4 years looking at it, and it's not a conspiracy. And the reason why it's not a conspiracy is that it's in plain sight. If you want to know who the Gates Foundation has funded, you can go to the Gates Foundation website, the little box in the left upper right-hand corner, and you can just plug in the name of Fordham Institute or Achieve Inc. or the Council of Chief State School Officers, and they'll tell you, and they'll map out how much money they give each one of these organizations to do this work. So it's not conspiratorial. I think there's enough things that are in front of us about the poor academic quality of Common Core, the lack of transparency in how it was developed, the illegality, the prohibitive costs, that are alarming enough. You don't need to look for black helicopters, or none of us need to be worried about conspiracy theories. I think it's just, a variety of financially self-interested organizations that have picked their moment. I will say that I think it's worse, actually, than healthcare, and the reason why it's worse is that whatever we want to say about healthcare, and people have different opinions on it, is that it did pass through Congress, and it was ultimately approved and validated by the U.S. Supreme Court. There was never any bill on Common Core or national standards or testing in the U.S. Congress. There were never any debates or hearings in the U.S. Congress about this. There was never really, across the country, any hearings or debates in most of the state legislatures. So in that regard, I think it's actually far worse. It's a far worse violation of the basic principles and fundamentals of our democracy than the healthcare model.
I just want to close by thanking especially Medway Matters, the group that put on this forum. Tremendous amount of work. And thank you all for coming. I hope that you have gained a deeper understanding of what Common Core is, and we will be leaving shortly. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Sandra.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.